Welcome to another lecture from your book. So today we're going to talk about difference, right? So difference in organizational communication and difference in the workplace. So to get started, let's define difference and see what it is we're talking about, right? I mean, we all theoretically know what difference means, what kind of things are different from one another. But in this context, we're dealing with a slightly different different definition of different, one that you might not be as familiar with. So the one of the definitions that your book cites, and one that really informs sort of the modern look at organizational communication, is one that suggests that difference is a social construction. And specifically, it's a social construction that's been used to classify human beings into separate value-based categories. So here again, I would normally ask you, like, what does this mean, and what do you think about it, right? Clearly, this differs from other conceptions of difference because it posits it or thinks of it as a social construction, meaning that it's something that we as human beings make. So it's not necessarily objectively occurring, and this is troublesome to many people, and rightly so, I think. Obviously, in the natural world, things are different. A desk is well, a tree. If we're talking about the natural world, a tree is not a rock, right? So these things are different. However, when we look at these differences and we place them into the separate value-based categories, that's the part that's socially constructed, right? So there are objective differences in the world. A tree is different than a rock. But the fact that we might value a tree more than a rock, right? That's a social construction. That's human beings asserting their will on these items, right? Asserting their viewpoints and assigning values based on their subjective experience. So another good example might be something like coal or things like coal and diamonds, right? So if you compress coal hard enough, you get a diamond, right? And diamonds are clearly to us more valuable than coal. However, that distinction in value is one that we put on them, right? There's nothing inherently more valuable about a diamond than a piece of coal. It's just that we choose to value them more. So that's really what I think your book is getting at when it tells you that difference is a social construction. Now, obviously, difference is connected to power. Okay, anyone who wasn't in the popular group in high school understands that difference is connected to power. So people in power make differences that create systems of enfranchisement and disenfranchisement. So in other words, the people in control look at others and say, they're like me, I'll share control with them, or they're not like me for the following reasons, and I'm better than them, right? And so I won't share with them. And I'm really breaking this down to an overly simplistic kind of reductivist frame. But I'm doing it because I think it's important to understand that this really is kind of a simple notion. Now, the further we delve into it, the more complex it gets. But at base, it's a pretty simple idea. So, again, it is at base a fairly simple concept. Sorry about that. I just had one of my kids bust into the room. So we also need to recognize that each binary system of difference. Now, by binary, we mean good or bad, black or white, male or female, right? So binary by two parts, right? So anytime we have a binary system of difference where we divide things into either or categories, it's characterized by a more highly valued pole and a less highly valued pole, right? So again, let's go back to coal and diamonds, right? Diamonds are dominant, they're on the more highly valued pole, and coal would be subordinate, it's on the less highly valued pole, right? So with people, right, instead of saying more highly valued or less highly valued, we just say either dominant or subordinate. And of course, over history, we've seen this play out, this kind of binary system throughout culture, not just American culture and society, but the world culture and society, right? So man woman is a binary system of difference, right? Men are not women, but the value that we ascribe to men or women, how we value them, is socially constructed, right? So typically in history, of course, when we look at the man-woman dichotomy, men have been more dominant culturally for whatever reason, right? Because we decided it was going to be that way. And so then men would be dominant and women would be subordinate. Now, it's important to recognize, by the way, that these things aren't necessarily correct, in quotation marks. This isn't the way things were naturally supposed to be. That's the point in saying that difference is constructed. This isn't natural. It's what we decided as people and the values that we ascribed to difference. So in scenarios where you have large organizations, the dominant group tends to become invisible. So what we mean by that is that people get used to it, right? So if a workplace is filled with white men and there's nobody else, right? After a while, this just seems natural. It seems like the way it's supposed to be, right? And then if we see a deviation from that norm, if a woman tries to enter the group, for example, then they're labeled as different and then targeted for classification and investigation. What do we make of this woman in our midst? How should we think of her? Right? And people try and make sense, create a narrative in a way around the presence of difference and figure out what it means, how it should be valued, what's happening with it. So by this definition then, difference, or more specifically the value that we assign to difference, is communicatively constructed. So difference is something we create. The value surrounding difference is something that we create when we talk about it, right? And then difference is also maintained through talk, through writing, and through social interactions and practices, right? So based on everything we just said, we could say that the values that we assign to differences are not naturally occurring. They're social constructions. They're values that we assign to them as human beings, and they're not part of the essence of these things. So these constructions then, the way that we think of difference, are normalized in organizations, right? They just become sort of standards that we're used to. And this kind of institutionalization serves the dominant group, right? It keeps the people in charge. And this is, of course, what people are looking for. This goes back to the idea of homosocial reproduction, right? Where you can get old boy networks because old white guys want to hire more old white guys. So in this sense, right, the dominant groups are organized so as to formally and informally marginalize difference. So that means that sometimes there are rules, right? No, you can't be part of our group because you're different in the following ways, right? So that would be a formal rule, right, that precludes inclusivity and tries to fend off difference, right? At other times, it's informally marginalized. So, this is when people, after a meeting, perhaps hear a coworker talk and say, "Oh, don't listen to her. She's a crazy woman," right? That would be an example of informal modes of marginalizing difference. So when we say marginalizing, what we're talking about is minimizing the impact of this difference. So again, this brings us back to the question that students often ask, which is, but differences do exist, right, Erik? I mean, they're not entirely socially constructed. And again, I want to say yes, but the values, it's all about the values that we ascribe to difference. Those are socially constructed. So when we talk about race, right, I mean, what we're talking about largely is a social construct. Specifically, what we see is that those in power have taken an arbitrary difference between groups of people, right, one that makes up a very small part of our DNA, and is constructed around it a massive cultural, political, and economic structure, right? So with race, what we do is we arbitrarily look at relatively minuscule deviations from the quote unquote norm in DNA, and then say, oh man, you're so different. So now we have to build this system that preserves whiteness and excludes people of color, right? Now, clearly, this is changing, right? I mean, this is clearly something that's changed. I mean, certainly since the 19th century, this has changed quite a bit. Nevertheless, we need to recognize that it's done both formally and informally, and that again, it's useful for the people in power to maintain their power in labeling and marginalizing difference, right? So, just because it's a construct doesn't mean that race doesn't organize the world in ways that have genuine material and economic consequences for people, right? Just because it's something, just because we make up the values that we ascribe to it, just because it's relatively arbitrary, doesn't mean that it doesn't have a huge impact on people's lived experience, right? All right, so that's it for the first lecture, and next time we'll talk more about race and organizational communication. Thanks for checking this out.